The one writing tip I would say is useful is to find the time of day that works best for you. We've all got times of the day when we're at our best and times of the day when we're a bit sleepy or a bit off. And I think if you find the time of day where you're at your most productive, corral that for your writing. It's always hard to pick a favourite book that you've written. I mean, it's a bit like saying which of your children do you like best. But the one that in a way is the kind of touchstone for me is The Mermaid Singing, because it was so different from anything I had done before, and it was such a difficult book for me to write. I got to the end of that and I figured that if I could make a success of that, then no book would ever be beyond me. I'd always be able to find a voice or a structure to tell the story that I needed to tell. I write between January and April. That's when the book gets written, and so I write. Some days I write pretty much all day, but I tend to write in 20-minute bursts and then do other things. Some days, because of other commitments, I'll write maybe in the morning or maybe late in the evening. I write either in my office or generally I write quite a lot on trains. I spend quite a lot of time on trains, and I find trains are really good places to write. It's hard to say which particular books inspired me specifically, but the book that turned me on to crime fiction was at a very early age, probably about 9 or 10, Agatha Christie's The Murder at the Vicarage. My grandparents only had 2 books in the house. They had the Bible and for some reason The Murder at the Vicarage. So whenever I ran out of the library books I'd brought with me, that was where I turned. And I think that's what turned me on to the idea of grown-up books having to have dead bodies in them. What's my guilty pleasure? Drinking whiskey late at night. Well, I sit down at the keyboard. I don't have superstitious rituals at all. I just get on with it and do it. I always wanted to be a writer from the moment I realised that it was a job you got paid money for. I used to read this series of books, kids' books called the Chalet School books. It was a series of books, and one of the characters in that grew up to become a writer, and that was one point where I realised it's a job. You get paid money for just telling lies and making stuff up. I thought I could do that. That's what I want to do. A book generally starts with me with something quite small. It's something that intrigues me, something that makes me go, oh, that's interesting, or oh, I didn't know that. And from there, I sort of file the idea away in the back of my head, and I'll pick up ill-considered trifles that seem to match with it, or bits that don't really match with it but end up matching with it. So over a period of time, idea will develop, and I'll pick it up and look at it and think about how it might be used. Then I get to know the characters whose story this might be, and eventually it starts to take shape. And when I sit down to start the book, I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about the characters, and I'll know the shape of the story. I know pretty much where I'm heading towards. I know probably who's going to die. I know probably who's going to have done it. But most of the steps along the way are discovered as I go along. It used to be very different. I used to write in a very structured way. I would plan it out scene by scene and then write it. But that changed about a dozen years ago, and now I have this much more free-form approach. The question I hate being asked is, where do you get your ideas from? I think that's probably everybody's least favourite question. They're everywhere. Ideas are cheap. It's time that's the problem. Developing them, figuring them out. But ideas are everywhere. Yeah, I've lost the odd chapter here and there. Back in the olden days when the computer systems weren't quite as reliable as they are now, and you couldn't just park everything on the cloud. I've had that thing where that chapter, I had it yesterday, and it's gone. But if you discover it's gone quickly enough, you can usually pretty well rebuild it on the basis of remembering it. Sort of, you let your brain just relax into it, and most of it will come back. Well, it's hard to say because I've lost the original. Every writer has experienced rejection at some time or another. You have to hold fast to the dream that you have something to say, and that you will find a way to say it in a way that people will want to read. I think the thing to do is, when you get a knockback, is to return to the arena where you learned how to write, and that is to read. So go back and read other people's work. Read the writers you admire, unpick what they've done and see what they've done right, and learn those lessons, and go back to your manuscript and see how you can apply them to what you've written. Nothing is perfect the first time. I've just written my 31st novel, and for me the most exciting moment is when I get my notes back from my editor after she's read it for the first time, and she's actually probably read it 3 times in a row over a weekend, and she comes back to me with the things that she doesn't think are working. And generally they are things that deep down, if I'm honest with myself, I know are not working. Nobody wants to send out a half-finished thing into the world. We all want the book to be the best thing it can be. And I'll tell you this, your first draft is never ever going to be the best it can be. There are always people who can help you make it better. And how you grow as a writer is to listen to those people and learn the lessons from them. Writing is essentially a solitary profession when you're writing fiction and writing poetry. And it's quite challenging sometimes, the thought of showing somebody else your precious baby when you've buffed it to the point where you think you've done the best you can do and you now have to give it to somebody else for a verdict. It's no use giving it to your family and your friends and your loved ones unless they also happen to be literary critics, because they love you and they'll tell you it's wonderful no matter how bad it is. What you need is to find a first reader who will be honest with you in a gentle way, not a savage way, but who will point out to you the things that don't work and maybe help you to figure out a way to make them work. Overcoming that fear really is the only way you're ever going to put the book into other people's hands. And ultimately we're all doing this because we want people to read our work. We don't want it hidden away. So you have to overcome that fear and find somebody that you can trust. I was a journalist by that stage, but journalism had always been the only thing I could do while I waited to become a proper writer. I've never been very good with authority, and journalism is famously non-hierarchical. And also, I've got a very low boredom threshold, so the thing about journalism is it's different things every day. So I thought I could manage being a journalist, wouldn't drive me completely mad, and I was possibly employable as a journalist. So while I was doing that, I'd realised by then that the problem with writing plays was that I didn't know what I was doing. And maybe I should think about writing something where I did have some vague notion of what I should be doing. And I'd always read crime fiction from the earliest age, and so I thought, well, I know how a crime novel works. You've got to have a dead body, you've got to have a detective, you've got to have either lots of suspects or no suspects at all, and at the end you've got to find out who did it. So that seemed to me to be a basic template, that I could maybe work with. And if I made my detective a journalist, then because I was a journalist, I knew what journalists did, it would be really easy, But then the problem I had, I suppose, was what kind of crime novel? Because in the UK, I don't have to tell you, in the UK in the early 80s, there was only police procedurals and village mysteries, neither of which fell into my span of knowledge. I'd discovered when I moved to England that the world was not like St Mary Mead, that Agatha Christie was essentially writing science fiction. Places did not exist. And so, it was some years later that Colin Dexter told me that you didn't have to know anything about the police to write police procedurals, you just made it up. But I didn't know that at the time.
This is for those of you who are not sure, this is Inspector Morse, all made up. Wonderful.
All made up, yeah. But the thing that really kick-started me was a friend sending me a copy of Sarah Paretsky's first book when it came out in America, Indemnity Only. She sent me this book with a note saying, I think you'll like this. And it was one of those, light bulb goes on in head moments.
It's incredible to think about it, but it's been 30 years since that book came out. And I reviewed it, and I remember very distinctly reading the first 8 pages and realizing that it was a woman writing it. She was the first. And it was such a shock. And it was so good. Everybody kept saying, oh, it's Sam Spade in skirts. It wasn't Sam Spade in skirts at all.
It was quite different.
Quite different.
And I loved the urban setting. It got completely away from St Mary Mead.
Yeah.
I loved that it had a female protagonist who wasn't wearing a pink fluffy bed jacket.
But who liked shoes.
Yeah, liked shoes.
Good shoes.
And who had a brain and a sense of humour.
Yeah.
And didn't have to get one of the guys to help her every time she needed some detecting doing.
Yeah.
But I also loved the fact that it had politics. It had personal politics and a wider sense of social politics. And it seemed to me that this was the kind of book I wanted to aspire to write. And so With that in front of me as an inspiration, I buckled down to write my first crime novel. Well, it's a nonsense, really, isn't it, to say your characters take on a life of their own. Really, if my characters had any agency, they'd be doing my shopping for me. Doing my ironing, cleaning my house, doing something useful. But the bottom line is your characters do what they do because it comes from inside you. There may be points along the way where you suddenly you make a sudden realization of what a character's capable of, but ultimately they come from inside your head and from your experience of the world. You cannot ultimately create anything that's outside your understanding and experience. Everything in those books ultimately comes from inside me. I'm sorry about that. For those of you who are maybe thinking I was quite a nice person, I'm sorry about that, But for me, the motive spring of the best crime fiction is always character. Suspense comes from character. Story comes from character. Everything comes from those creations inside my head. The suspense comes from character because the readers are passionate about those characters. They love them or they hate them, but they have to know what happens to them. And that's why you want to read the next chapter, because you're desperate to find out what happens to these people. What's the next stage? What's the next step on the journey? Are they going to make the next step on the journey? And so when I'm starting off with a book, I start in a slightly different place depending if it's series or if it's standalone. If it's series, you've already got your characters in place. You've got that nexus of central characters, and they do the things they do because they are the people they are. And with the best will in the world, Tony Hill isn't suddenly going to turn into an action hero. He's not going to be abseiling down a tall building, or karate kicking his way to freedom. It's not what he is, it's not what he does. So when I'm starting with a Tony Hill novel, I know who I'm dealing with, so the story has to work within the confines of those characters. When I'm working on a standalone, I can be led initially by story. I can make the story work in its own terms. And then I have to find out whose story it is. Who are these people? Why are they in my living room? What are they doing here? Where did they come from? What has turned them into the people who behave in this particular way? So it all becomes a to and fro process. Here's what I need them to do in this novel. Why would you do those things? What has made you the person you are? So I'm constantly raking through my own experience of the world. I'm raking through the lives of my friends, my family. Nobody's sacred. Sorry, we're vampires. We eat our own lives and then we just suck the blood out of everybody else's. It's not a nice thing. But, if you know a writer, if your best friend is a writer, you just watch their eyes the next time you're telling them something terrible about your life. Because the human being in them is totally sympathetic and supportive, and they mean it when they say, I'll be here for you. But the writer in them's going, could you just say that again? I didn't quite catch it. So that's what we do, and those characters end up, they're constructed from that data bank of human behaviour that I've observed, that I've seen.